The silent scribes, evidence suggests ancient scribes acted as covert power brokers. In the glow of flickering oil lamps, within the mud-brick walls of ancient palaces, the future of kingdoms often rested not in the hands of kings, but in the quiet strokes of a reed pen. Scribes, those seemingly humble record-keepers, were far more than mere administrators. They were the invisible architects of power, the ones who decided how history would be remembered, and perhaps how it would unfold. In ancient Mesopotamia, around 3000 BCE, writing emerged not as art, but as control. Cuneiform script, impressed on damp clay tablets, allowed a select class of literate elites to document everything from grain inventories to royal decrees. These scribes were trained in temple schools, where language itself became a guarded weapon. While rulers issued commands, scribes shaped those commands into official form, often determining their tone, their reach, and their permanence. A king could declare war. A scribe decided how that war would be inscribed for eternity. One of the clearest glimpses of their power comes from the Code of Hammurabi, etched on a towering black stele around 1750 BCE. We're taught to see this as a single, unchanging legal document, but in reality, multiple tablet versions have been found, with subtle differences in wording. Some of these differences shift tax obligations or alter land rights. Were these variations royal edits or scribal interventions? Scholars still debate whether scribes quietly shaped law to benefit local elites or temple factions. Egyptian scribes wielded their authority even more mysteriously. Deep inside temples, a special form of cryptographic hieroglyphs was used, a language within a language, accessible only to trained initiates. These weren't decorative, they encoded ritual knowledge, theological nuance, and sometimes state secrets. Inscriptions on temple walls in places like Abydos and Karnak contain these hidden layers, invisible to most Egyptians of the time. Fringe researchers have argued that these encrypted texts allowed scribes to share information among a closed intellectual network, influencing both priesthood and royalty from behind the scenes. Consider the Amarna letters, a collection of clay tablets discovered in the 19th century at Tel el Amarna, Egypt. Written in Akkadian, the diplomatic lingua franca, they reveal complex correspondence between Egypt and other Near Eastern powers in the 14th century BCE. Nestled among formalities are odd phrases like the silent word and the hidden tongue. Some linguists believe these refer to a kind of coded language, an early form of diplomatic cipher understood only by trained scribes. If true, these tablets are less a straightforward historical record than the remnants of a covert communication web. It wasn't just diplomacy. Scribes controlled chronicles, genealogies, and prophecies. A single stroke could erase an enemy's name from official annals, delegitimize a bloodline, or revise a celestial omen to favor the ruling dynasty. In one Babylonian proverb, we find a chilling acknowledgement of this power. The scribe's reed is sharper than the warrior's spear. Through their words, kingdoms rose or fell in posterity. What's written survives, what isn't vanishes. And these men, often anonymous, trained from childhood to read what few could, were the gatekeepers. Modern historians debate the extent of scribal agency. Some see them as loyal servants, reflecting royal will. Others suspect a more active role, subtle manipulation, quiet censorship, even steering political outcomes through selective recording. What remains undeniable is that their fingerprints are everywhere, though their names rarely appear. We often imagine history as writ and by kings. In truth, it was carved by hands we never knew, hands that may have held more real power than any crown. The forgotten treaty, A vanished pact between rival kingdoms may have altered world history. In the dusty plains between two once mighty empires, a fragile piece of clay once bore witness to a promise, a treaty that may have changed the course of the ancient world. Today, fragments of that agreement are scattered across museum shelves, incomplete sentences from a story deliberately buried. During the Late Bronze Age, around the 13th century BCE, two great powers dominated the Near East: Egypt under Pharaoh Ramesses II and the Hittite Empire, centered in modern-day Turkey. These two states were bitter rivals, their armies clashing spectacularly at the Battle of Kadesh around 1274 BCE, one of the earliest recorded battles in history. Chariots thundered, archers unleashed clouds of arrows, and both sides claimed victory. But what followed the battle was even more remarkable: a peace treaty. Known today as the Treaty of Kadesh, this document is often celebrated as the world's first surviving international peace accord. Versions have been found both in Egypt, carved into temple walls at Thebes, and in the Hittite capital of Hattusa, inscribed on clay tablets. Both proclaim eternal peace and mutual defense. But here's the puzzle. The Egyptian and Hittite versions do not perfectly align. Some passages exist in one but not the other. Phrases are altered, timelines slightly shifted. One striking example involves a line in the Hittite version pledging to aid each other against foreign aggressors. In the Egyptian wall relief, this section is conspicuously missing. Scholars have long debated why. Was it a scribal omission, a translation quirk? Or was Egypt deliberately presenting a sanitized version, shaping public perception while keeping the full text secret in palace archives? Even more intriguing is a rumour that circulated among 20th century archaeologists working in Anatolia that a second treaty, predating Kadesh by decades, once existed. According to excavation reports from the 1920s, an unusually large clay tablet was found shattered in a sealed storeroom beneath Hattusa. Its language resembled diplomatic Akkadian, but many fragments disappeared into private collections before they could be properly recorded. Some researchers believe this was evidence of a hidden alliance between Egypt and the Hittites, a clandestine pact to divide contested Levantine territories. If such a treaty existed, it would rewrite our understanding of the Late Bronze Age power dynamic. Egypt and the Hittites were not merely adversaries. They may have been co-conspirators, negotiating in secret while staging battles for prestige and control. A scenario emerges: a public war to satisfy their elites and populations, followed by a covert territorial agreement to stabilize trade routes. There's another layer. Some of the surviving tablets contain seal impressions of unfamiliar symbols, not Egyptian, not Hittite. A few fringe historians have argued these may represent a third party, perhaps a smaller but influential polity mediating between the superpowers. Mainstream scholars remain cautious, but the presence of unexplained seals fuels speculation that the treaty may have been part of a broader diplomatic network, one that modern textbooks barely acknowledge. Why would such a treaty be buried? One theory suggests political vulnerability. Alliances between historic enemies often rely on secrecy to avoid backlash. Ramesses II, famous for his grand monuments and self-aggrandizing inscriptions, likely preferred to be remembered as a warrior pharaoh rather than a quiet negotiator. The Hittites, too, were struggling with internal dissent. A public admission of collusion could have fractured their legitimacy. Today, scholars still debate whether the so-called missing treaty was a myth, a misunderstood archaeological find, or a deliberate cover-up erased from official records. But what remains is a tantalizing gap between temple inscriptions and diplomatic tablets, between what was shown to the people and what was agreed in shadowed rooms. In that gap, history may have taken a turn we no longer see, a turn inked on clay, then shattered, scattered and nearly forgotten, The cartographer's cipher. Strange map markings hint at secret navigation routes centuries early. Long before satellites traced our coastlines and GPS mapped the planet, ancient cartographers may have encoded their knowledge in ways meant to be understood only by a chosen few. Some maps that survive from antiquity contain curious patterns, lines, symbols, and annotations that don't match known geography or trade routes. For centuries, these markings were dismissed as errors or embellishments, but a closer look suggests something more deliberate, a ciphered language of navigation hidden in plain sight. The most famous case often cited is the Piri Reis map, created in 1513 by the Ottoman admiral and cartographer Piri Reis. Although not truly ancient in the strictest sense, the map is based on older source charts, some of which Piri Reis explicitly credits to ancient kings. The map shows astonishingly accurate coastlines of South America and parts of Antarctica, details supposedly unknown to early modern Europe. But what's often overlooked are the grid-like annotations and peculiar sigils drawn along these coastlines. Some researchers believe these are navigational keys inherited from earlier, now lost charts. Older still are the Babylonian world maps, such as the famous Imago Mundi tablet dating to the 6th century BCE. It presents a circular world surrounded by water, with cities and regions labelled. Around the edges are 7 enigmatic triangles, each pointing outward. For generations, scholars called these mythical regions. Yet a recent fringe hypothesis proposes that the triangles may encode directional bearings toward real, distant lands known to ancient explorers. Scholars still debate whether these triangles are symbolic representations or navigational markers akin to modern compass roses. In ancient Egypt, tomb murals and temple carvings sometimes display what look like stylized coastlines or river deltas, particularly in the tomb of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu. A series of carved lines accompanied by hieroglyphic phrases referring to the secret path of the ships has drawn attention. Mainstream Egyptologists view this as ritual imagery. Others wonder if these are schematic maps, their true meaning intelligible only to trained scribes and navigators. A particularly intriguing find surfaced in 1993 in southern Turkey. A set of bronze discs etched with intersecting arcs and dots unearthed near what was once an important Hittite port. At first, archaeologists thought they were decorative objects, but some mathematicians have suggested the discs resemble projection grids, frameworks used to translate curved geography onto flat surfaces. If correct, these artifacts would predate known Western mapping projection systems by over a millennium. Why would ancient navigators hide their routes? Power and profit, control over maritime corridors, especially in the Mediterranean and along the Red Sea, meant control over trade, spices, metals, grain, even people. Merchant guilds, priestly elites, and royal navies all had reason to keep such information secret. Some inscriptions hint at maps of the Forbidden Sea, entrusted only to specific families or religious orders. It's not hard to imagine how those who possessed reliable navigational charts might guard them like state secrets. This culture of secrecy may explain why certain ancient maps appear decorated with indecipherable symbols. A few late Roman itineraries, for example, feature strings of letters along coastlines that don't match any known language. Classical scholars sometimes dismiss these as scribal errors. Others argue they might be code words, references to ports or hazards meant only for insiders. Mainstream historians acknowledge that ancient peoples were accomplished sailors. The Phoenicians, for instance, circumnavigated Africa under Egyptian sponsorship around 600 BCE, if Herodotus is to be believed. But whether they left behind coded maps or encrypted instructions remains contested. Scholars still debate if these anomalies represent real cartographic intelligence or are simply misunderstood religious symbols. Yet the pattern is consistent across cultures. Where knowledge of the seas conferred power, that knowledge was obscured. A few surviving artifacts, a broken tablet here, a marked bronze disc there, may be the last traces of a hidden global navigation tradition, carefully kept from outsiders and perhaps destroyed when regimes fell. Somewhere between those strange lines and triangles lies a story of explorers, merchants, and power brokers who mapped the world long before history says they did, and left behind clues for those able to read their cipher. The Veiled Conqueror, a military leader, may have ruled empires under multiple hidden names. Across the shifting landscapes of antiquity, empires rose and fell under banners we think we understand. Kings carved their names in stone, pharaohs proclaimed their glory in hieroglyphs, emperors minted their faces onto coins. But occasionally the record flickers, names vanish, timelines blur, and figures emerge who feel eerily similar despite different titles and languages. Some historians and fringe researchers alike have begun to ask a startling question. What if a single powerful military figure once ruled under multiple identities, spanning regions and cultures, leaving behind a trail of altered names and deliberately fragmented records? One of the most debated examples is the figure sometimes called the Veiled Conqueror, a shadowy leader who seems to appear in the archives of the late Bronze and early Iron Ages under various guises. In Anatolian inscriptions, there is mention of a formidable general who led mercenaries against both Egyptian and Hittite forces. In Egyptian reliefs, a foreign warlord is depicted as both adversary and ally within the same generation. Meanwhile, Levantine tablets refer to the Stranger King, a title never attached to a known monarch. The first thread begins in Egypt, during the tumultuous decades following the reign of Ramesses II. Reliefs at Medinet Habu, the mortuary temple of Ramesses III, depict invasions by mysterious groups collectively known as the Sea Peoples. Among them, one leader is portrayed distinctly, tall, bearded, wearing a feathered headdress unlike any neighbouring culture. He leads fleets, besieges cities, and eventually appears negotiating before the pharaoh. His name, however, is damaged on the inscription, a break in the stone where his identifying glyphs should be. Some scholars call this a coincidence. Others suspect deliberate erasure. At the same time, Hittite archives mention a foreign commander hired as both mercenary and intermediary, known only by a title that translates roughly to the Veiled One or Masked Lord. This figure disappears abruptly from records just as Egypt's mysterious warlord emerges. A Levantine chronicle discovered near Ugarit, dated to roughly the same period, speaks cryptically of the stranger who wore many names, who took lands by contract and by sword. Mainstream historians explain these similarities as the inevitable overlap of chaotic times. Multiple chieftains could have resembled one another, or scribes could have merged stories. But some fringe historians argue for a bolder hypothesis, that this was one person, deliberately adopting new names as he moved across collapsing empires, forging mercenary armies, and inserting himself into power vacuums. One reason this theory persists is the curious synchronization of events across regions. A series of city sackings in Anatolia lines up almost perfectly with invasions recorded in Egyptian reliefs and diplomatic disruptions in Canaan, all within a narrow 5-year window. The logistics of such widespread actions would require remarkable coordination or, as some suggest, a single charismatic leader commanding mobile forces. There's also the matter of iconography. A handful of stelae from different regions depict a warrior with strikingly similar features, the same tall plumed headdress, the same distinctive long beard, even similar weaponry. The inscriptions give different names, some possibly titles, some perhaps transliterations into local tongues. Scholars still debate whether these images represent a shared enemy figure, mythologized across cultures, or a single warlord adapting to each new political environment. Why would such a conqueror hide behind shifting identities? One possibility is political survival. In a world where kingship was often tied to bloodlines and divine sanction, a foreigner could never openly claim thrones in multiple lands, but a figure who appeared as a liberator in one place, a mercenary in another, and a king in a third, could move through power structures like a shadow, always one step ahead of historical record-keeping. Another theory involves scribal manipulation. If different empires recorded the same man under different names, intentionally or accidentally, later generations would see multiple rulers where there was one, and if scribes later expunged or altered his name for political reasons, the true identity would be buried permanently. Scholars still debate whether the Veiled Conqueror ever truly existed, or if he's an illusion formed by gaps in our sources. But the uncanny alignments, broken names, overlapping campaigns, repeated iconography, suggest that someone, somewhere, may have once ruled more widely than history dares to remember, and did so behind a carefully crafted mask of names. Whispers in the Obsidian, encoded messages in Obsidian mirrors suggest ancient espionage. Under the faint torchlight of a royal chamber, a polished black mirror glimmers, its surface cold, almost liquid, as if holding secrets within. To the uninitiated, it might seem merely decorative, a luxury object reserved for priests or queens, but scattered across Mesoamerica, the Near East, and parts of Anatolia, archaeologists have unearthed obsidian mirrors, whose peculiar engravings and deliberate placement hint at a purpose beyond vanity or ritual. Some researchers now believe these mirrors may have played a role in early intelligence networks, carrying encrypted information through reflection, engraving, and controlled light. Obsidian, a volcanic glass sharper than steel and capable of an uncanny polish, has long fascinated civilizations. In ancient Mesoamerica, the Aztecs revered obsidian mirrors as tools of divination. The god Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, is often depicted gazing into an obsidian disc, seeing distant lands or enemy movements. Spanish chroniclers recorded that priests used these mirrors to watch what happened afar, though it's unclear whether this was purely symbolic. But long before the Aztecs, Neolithic sites in Anatolia, like Çatalhöyük, yielded fragments of obsidian so finely shaped they could reflect light in narrow beams. Some experimental archaeologists have shown that flat, polished obsidian plates can project light signals across distances if angled correctly, essentially a primitive form of optical signaling. The idea that mirrors could be used for long-range communication isn't far-fetched. The Greeks and Romans later used polished shields to reflect sunlight, and in the 19th century, heliographs revolutionized military signaling. Could the ancients have done something similar thousands of years earlier? Several finds deepen the mystery. At a late Bronze Age site in northern Syria, a cache of small, disc-like obsidian mirrors was discovered alongside tablets written in Akkadian. Curiously, the tablets contain references to black eyes that speak and the tongues of stone. Initially thought to be poetic metaphors, these phrases are repeated in administrative contexts, implying a more technical function. Some fringe historians argue that these phrases could describe a coded communication system where light reflected from mirrors signaled pre-arranged messages between watchtowers or diplomatic outposts. Adding to this is the discovery of microscopic etchings on the backs of certain Mesoamerican mirrors. A study in the early 2000s found faint patterns, dots, lines and spirals, invisible to the naked eye but arranged in deliberate sequences. While mainstream archaeologists interpret these as decorative or ritual, some cryptographers have noted similarities to early cipher grids. Whether intentional or coincidental, These markings suggest a level of encoded meaning far beyond ornamentation. The value of such a system is obvious. In a time when dispatching messengers over hostile terrain took weeks, instant communication across even a few miles could offer immense military or diplomatic advantage. Imagine fortified hills equipped with mirror bearers, relaying urgent warnings of invasion, secret troop movements, or news of betrayal, information transmitted silently and at the speed of light. One particularly tantalizing tablet from Ugarit speaks of words that travel without feet, shining upon the night hills. Scholars still debate whether this refers to metaphoric divine messages or actual signalling. The phrasing, however, is strikingly similar to later descriptions of mirror signalling among classical civilizations. Why Obsidian? Its unique reflective properties allowed for controlled, narrow beams of light, unlike bronze, which scatters reflections. Moreover, Obsidian's sacred associations may have provided cover. Priests could operate mirrors openly during rituals, while simultaneously transmitting hidden messages to distant allies. Of course, this theory remains controversial. Mainstream scholars caution against projecting modern intelligence concepts onto ancient artifacts. Perhaps the mirrors were purely ceremonial, used in divination rather than espionage. But even skeptics admit that the combination of mirror placement, coded engravings, and administrative references to speaking stones is unusual. Scholars still debate whether these enigmatic objects were tools of prophecy or the world's earliest communication devices. Yet the possibility lingers that somewhere atop windswept hills, as armies gathered beyond the horizon, flickers of light from obsidian mirrors once carried the whispered strategies of empires hidden in reflections only a select few could interpret. The vanished archive of 9. Rumours persist of a secret council preserving forbidden knowledge. In the twilight of collapsing empires, when fires consumed libraries and invaders toppled monuments, whispers spread of a hidden refuge, not of stone, but of minds. Somewhere beyond the reach of kings and priests, a secret circle of 9 scholars is said to have gathered, safeguarding dangerous knowledge from both time and tyranny. The story of this vanished archive of 9 drifts between myth and history, but traces of it appear in cultures oceans apart, as though different civilizations were remembering fragments of the same secret. One of the earliest references comes from India, in accounts dating to the reign of Emperor Ashoka the Great, 3rd century BCE. According to later legends, Ashoka, horrified by the carnage of his conquests, turned toward the pursuit of knowledge and spiritual reform. It is said that he convened 9 men, each entrusted with guarding a specific field of advanced wisdom, from military science and communication to physiology, astronomy, and social engineering. These 9 unknown men, as the story calls them, supposedly compiled knowledge too powerful for public release. Some modern historians trace this legend to the writings of the French author Louis Jacoliot and later popularizers in the 19th century, but older Sanskrit and Buddhist references do mention councils of learned men working under Ashoka's patronage in secrecy. Strikingly similar motifs appear in other regions. In Hellenistic Egypt, a curious tale surfaces in late Ptolemaic texts. 9 scribes, sworn to protect the inner writings of Thoth, retreated from Alexandria shortly before the first great fire that consumed its legendary library. Some late Roman historians claimed that certain scrolls, especially those dealing with mechanical devices and forbidden rites, were spirited away to a monastery beyond the Red Sea. No proof has surfaced, but fragments of obscure treatises on hydraulics, optics, and celestial mechanics found in desert caches hint that something valuable left the city before its destruction. In Mesopotamian lore, a set of Akkadian tablets refers cryptically to the 9 seats of the hidden house, where scholars debated under moonlight to decide which truths humanity was ready to hear. Some believe this was poetic metaphor for elite temple schools. Others suspect a real network of intellectuals bound by oath who kept certain discoveries from public or political hands. Why 9? Across cultures, the number recurs almost ritualistically. In Hindu cosmology, 9 often symbolizes completeness. In Egyptian tradition, the Ennead, a group of 9 deities, represents cosmic order. Some fringe historians suggest that adopting 9 as a symbolic number allowed these councils to cloak their existence in religious language, shielding real-world activities behind divine allegory. Mainstream historians argue that the 9 unknown are likely a legend, perhaps inspired by real scholarly councils that once existed under imperial patronage, but intriguing anomalies persist. For example, certain ancient manuscripts abruptly end mid-discussion, with marginal notes hinting that the remainder was to be given only to the 9. Other texts found in monasteries along the Silk Road mention travelling teachers who carried no scrolls, yet possessed extraordinary knowledge of medicine and mechanics, knowledge that didn't resurface in the historical record until centuries later. One particularly strange case is a fragmentary Greek papyrus found in Oxyrhynchus, Egypt. It refers to 9 keepers who gathered at the end of empire to seal that which should not be forged anew. Scholars still debate whether this is allegory, propaganda, or evidence of an actual group working to suppress dangerous technologies, perhaps knowledge of weaponry, mass control, or advanced engineering that could destabilize fragile societies. The idea of a clandestine council protecting forbidden knowledge may sound like pure myth, yet history offers many parallels. The hidden scholars of Timbuktu, the monastic scriptoria preserving Roman texts through the Dark Ages, or the medieval secret societies safeguarding esoteric manuscripts. Why should the ancient world have been any different? What makes the vanished archive of 9 so compelling is its elusiveness. No single civilization claims it outright, yet whispers of 9 guardians surface across millennia. Were they simply symbols of wisdom, or a real network, deliberately erasing their tracks as empires fell, preserving fragments of knowledge we've only partially rediscovered? Scholars still debate whether the 9 ever existed outside of legend, but if they did, their greatest success may have been this: to leave behind just enough traces to be remembered, but not enough to be found. The twin capitals, 2 cities, thousands of miles apart, appear to have shared governance. Across the ancient world, power tended to cluster in a single city. Thebes ruled Upper Egypt, Babylon dominated Mesopotamia, and Rome cast its shadow over an empire. But scattered through the archaeological record is an enigma that defies this pattern, evidence that 2 distant cities, separated by thousands of miles, may once have shared governance, acting almost as twin capitals of a single hidden political structure. The earliest hints of this mystery emerge in the Middle Bronze Age, around 1800 to 1600 BCE. Excavations at Mari, an influential city on the Euphrates, have revealed thousands of administrative tablets, some written in Akkadian, others in an unfamiliar hybrid dialect. A subset of these documents refers to another seat of power located far to the west, described with titles identical to Mari's own royal court. One tablet even records the law was spoken in both thrones, as if 2 cities issued joint decrees, yet no known neighbouring polity matches this description. Meanwhile, across the Mediterranean, on the island of Crete, the Minoan civilization flourished in roughly the same period. Their great palatial complex at Knossos was a centre of trade and ritual power, but curiously, some Minoan Linear A tablets contain seals and motifs that are near identical to those found in Mari, particularly a double spiral emblem and a stylized bull's head crest. Traditional explanations describe this as mere trade contact, but the frequency and placement of these symbols in legal and administrative contexts suggest something more formal, perhaps indicating shared bureaucratic practices. The puzzle deepens with the discovery of two nearly identical royal inscriptions. In the 1930s, archaeologists found a fragmentary stele in northern Syria that outlined the foundation of a city under the gaze of two kings. Decades later, a Cretan artifact bearing a similar inscription, in a different script but with parallel phrasing, was uncovered in a storeroom at Knossos. Both texts mention the union of the pillars, a phrase not found elsewhere. Scholars have debated whether this refers to a mythological motif or an actual treaty between distant centres of power. Why would two cities so far apart share governance? One possibility involves maritime networks. By the 2nd millennium BCE, Minoan merchants sailed deep into the eastern Mediterranean. Some historians believe Minoan fleets may have supported inland polities like Mari through exclusive trade agreements, perhaps exchanging naval protection for agricultural wealth and metals. This could have produced an unusual dual arrangement, one inland capital managing land-based economies and one maritime capital controlling trade routes, functioning almost like a bicameral state split by geography. Another possibility is religious or dynastic linkage. Both Mari and Knossos placed extraordinary emphasis on bull iconography, sacred labyrinth imagery, and ceremonial processions. Some fringe researchers have speculated about a shared religious elite coordinating policies across regions, though mainstream scholarship remains cautious. A few rare tablets even refer to emissaries called messengers of the twin seats, though the original term is damaged and its translation debated. Perhaps the most intriguing evidence lies in calendrical synchronization. Tablets from Mari and ritual texts from Knossos follow surprisingly similar lunar reckoning systems, down to the naming of certain festival days. This is highly unusual, as calendar systems typically diverged sharply between regions. A synchronized calendar implies joint planning of religious or political events, something that would be difficult to maintain without structured communication and shared governance. Skeptics argue these parallels are coincidences, the inevitable byproduct of trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. They point out that no single text explicitly states that Mari and Knossos ruled together. Yet, the overlapping administrative symbols, shared ceremonial language, and references to dual thrones remain difficult to dismiss entirely. Scholars still debate whether the idea of twin capitals is a modern projection or a glimpse of a sophisticated political experiment lost to time. Were Mari and Knossos linked by a secretive maritime dynastic alliance, a shared religious elite, or perhaps a more formalized joint governance structure that later vanished without record? Whatever the truth, the evidence suggests a relationship far deeper than trade, a partnership that blurred borders, synchronized calendars, and may have created a hidden axis of power stretching from Mesopotamia to the Aegean, centuries before empires like Persia or Rome unified such distances. The seer's ledger, oracle inscriptions may have doubled as encrypted political intelligence. In the heart of the ancient Greek world, high atop the slopes of Mount Parnassus, the Oracle of Delphi whispered cryptic answers to kings, generals, and commoners alike. The Pythia, seated above a chasm, inhaling sweet vapours, spoke in riddles that shaped wars, coronations, and colonial ventures. For centuries, Delphi was considered a spiritual epicentre, a place where mortals sought the will of the gods. But among the thousands of inscriptions, tablets, and dedications left behind, a strange pattern emerges. One suggesting that the oracle's pronouncements may have doubled as encrypted political communications, understood only by a select few. The Delphic inscriptions, carved into stone and bronze, record consultations between the oracle and leaders from across the Greek world. Many appear as short poetic phrases, riddles, or ritual records. Yet several tablets contain numerical notations, unusual abbreviations, or secondary markings that don't fit the poetic or religious content. Some of these marks are discreetly placed along the edges of the inscriptions, often in sequences that resemble tally systems or ciphers. One famous example is the so-called Ledger of Themistocles, a partially preserved bronze tablet discovered near Delphi in the 19th century. The inscription contains what seems to be a standard Delphic consultation concerning naval strategy against Persia. But surrounding the text are groups of 3 and 4 character symbols arranged in repeating sequences. For decades, they were thought to be masons' marks or decorative flourishes. Recent computational analysis suggests these sequences follow structured substitution patterns remarkably similar to ancient numeral systems or simple monoalphabetic ciphers. This raises an unsettling possibility that oracular consultations may have been used to transmit coded information between elites under the guise of religious ritual. Imagine a Spartan envoy arriving with an official question. The Pythia gives her response, heard by witnesses, but the accompanying tablet or inscription carries a hidden parallel message intended only for a trained interpreter back home. A subtle way to bypass rival spies and even other city-states' intelligence networks. Further evidence comes from Delphic treasuries, the small buildings constructed by various Greek states to house offerings and display their devotion. Some treasuries, particularly those of Corinth and Athens, contain inscriptions whose metrical irregularities seem intentional. Scholars have noted odd spacing, misplaced syllables, and broken meter, all of which could indicate acrostic or steganographic techniques, where hidden words or messages are embedded within poetry. This wasn't unique to Greece. In Mesopotamia, scribes sometimes embedded messages in religious hymns by inserting certain signs at regular intervals. In Egypt, temple inscriptions occasionally carried secondary cryptographic hieroglyphs, concealed meanings accessible only to trained priests. The practice of encoding information inside sacred or poetic texts was widespread. What makes Delphi special is that it functioned as an international hub. Messages encrypted there could travel with ambassadors and traders across the Aegean, Anatolia, and beyond. Another intriguing clue lies in Delphi's administrative records. A small number of surviving financial tablets show the oracle receiving payments from powerful families not just for consultations, but for recording and transmission services. What exactly was being transmitted? Mainstream historians assume this refers to formal oracular responses being copied and sent. But a growing number of researchers argue this so language could refer to controlled dissemination of sensitive political intelligence disguised within religious documents. One theory posits that the priests of Apollo acted as intermediaries, collecting political information from envoys, encoding it into inscriptions, and relaying it to allied states. In this way, Delphi became more than a religious centre. It was a nerve hub of pan-Hellenic diplomacy, cloaked in divine mystery. Of course, the idea that Delphi doubled as an intelligence agency is controversial. Traditional classicists argue that the irregularities are either stylistic quirks or errors introduced by stonemasons, but the repeated patterns, cipher-like markings, and administrative phrasing persist. Scholars still debate whether these are coincidences or signs of a deliberate, sophisticated communication system. What's undeniable is that Delphi's influence wasn't confined to prophecy. Its inscriptions travelled with armies, ambassadors, and merchants. Its words could start wars or broker peace. And perhaps, just perhaps, beneath the riddles of the gods lay a ledger of human secrets, encoded, inscribed, and hidden in plain sight on the stones of an oracle's sanctuary. The Shadow Monks, a forgotten sect, allegedly controlled communication between empires. In the narrow mountain passes of central Anatolia, where caravans snaked between east and west, cloaked figures once moved silently along hidden paths. They did not carry swords, nor did they wield crowns, but something far more dangerous in the ancient world: information. Legends and scattered references across texts from the Near East, Persia, and the Mediterranean suggest the existence of a shadowy sect of monks or scribes who acted as intermediaries between empires, controlling the flow of messages, diplomacy, and possibly intelligence. History remembers kings and generals, but these figures, if they existed, operated in silence, ensuring empires remained connected or divided. The earliest trace comes from a puzzling passage in a Neo-Assyrian tablet dated to the 8th century BCE. It speaks of the black hoods who know every road and carry the king's breath between lands. At first, scholars assumed this referred to royal couriers, but the phrasing is odd. These black hoods were not described as servants or soldiers, but as keepers of the tongue, who do not belong to any city. A similar phrase appears in Achaemenid Persian inscriptions, referencing those who walk the night roads and bind kings with speech. Around the same time, records from Phrygia and Lydia mention monastic communities living near caravanserais, the ancient equivalent of rest stations along trade routes. These monks offered lodging, spiritual guidance, and written services for merchants and envoys. Curiously, inscriptions found at several of these sites include multilingual administrative records in languages ranging from Aramaic and Lydian to early Greek, all in the same hand. This suggests a level of linguistic training and coordination unusual for isolated religious groups. Some historians believe these monks acted as neutral scribes, facilitating communication between different empires in a way that allowed information to travel securely. Others see a more conspiratorial angle, that these communities formed a clandestine network, intercepting, translating, and subtly altering messages between powers, effectively controlling diplomacy from behind the scenes. Supporting this theory is a Persian administrative letter found near Sardis, referring to the brothers of the hidden path who delivered the letters of Darius to the Western kings, but were not to be counted among royal messengers. The distinction is crucial. These individuals were trusted with imperial communications, but operated outside the official courier system, answerable to no king. Their influence may have extended beyond paperwork. Greek historians like Herodotus mention mysterious interpreters who accompanied embassies between Persia and Greek city-states. They were neither citizens nor foreign delegates. They occupied a strange intermediary position. Some bore shaved heads and distinctive black robes, reminiscent of monastic orders. Herodotus never names their group, but he hints that their loyalty was to no single hearth. Why would empires tolerate such an independent network? Possibly because they were indispensable. In a world where diplomacy hinged on precise translation, message security, and timing, these shadow monks might have provided a trusted infrastructure, or at least one too entrenched to replace. Their monasteries lay on crucial trade arteries, like the royal road in Persia or the caravan routes feeding into the Mediterranean. Without their services, diplomatic correspondence might have faltered. Some fringe historians go further, suggesting the monks did more than transmit messages. They may have shaped them. By subtly altering wording or controlling when information reached its destination, they could manipulate political events without ever drawing a sword. A delayed message could cause an army to miss an alliance. A mistranslated phrase could incite conflict between neighbours. If true, this would make them one of the earliest forms of an organised intelligence service. Skeptics argue these monks were simply translators and scribes, necessary intermediaries in a multilingual world, but the recurring phrases across civilizations, keepers of the tongue, brothers of the path, black hoods who know every road, suggest something more structured than scattered translators. Scholars still debate whether they were a coordinated sect, an informal network, or a later mythologized creation. If they did exist, their greatest weapon was anonymity. They left no manifestos, no royal seals, no grand temples, only faint mentions in administrative records and travellers' tales. Their power lay not in being seen, but in being everywhere, shaping empires with whispers, translations, and the timing of a letter's arrival. The Phantom Expedition, a fleet recorded in one civilization's texts, is missing from all others. In the annals of ancient empires, naval expeditions were rarely small affairs. Fleets meant power, the projection of a ruler's reach over trade, conquest, or exploration, and yet, buried in a handful of inscriptions and royal tablets, is the story of a massive expedition that one civilization proudly recorded, and which no neighbouring culture ever acknowledged. Historians call it the Phantom Expedition, a voyage that appears to have vanished not only from the seas, but from the collective memory of its supposed allies, rivals, and victims. The story begins in pharaonic Egypt during the reign of Sahure, the second king of Egypt's 5th dynasty, around 2480 BCE. Reliefs in his pyramid complex at Abusir depict an extraordinary scene. Large, well-organized ships sailing to foreign lands, bearing exotic goods like incense, myrrh, and rare woods. Accompanying inscriptions speak of a great fleet sent south to the land of Punt and east to islands unknown. It's one of the earliest known depictions of a seafaring expedition in Egyptian history. Egyptian reliefs often exaggerated, but this was different. The ships are detailed with multiple sails, steering oars, and cargo holds, suggesting a fleet designed for extended voyages. The inscriptions describe a king's envoy leading many ships beyond the Red Sea to lands of shining peaks and rising mists. Strangely, no known foreign inscriptions from the Levant, Mesopotamia, the Horn of Africa, or Arabia make any mention of receiving such a fleet. Centuries later, during the Middle Kingdom, another Egyptian ruler, Mentuhotep III, recorded a similar grand expedition to Punt, but again, no Puntite inscriptions or neighbouring cultures reference Egyptian ships arriving. The Egyptians left meticulous records of their foreign campaigns, and other civilizations often recorded their own encounters with Egyptian envoys. For these expeditions, there's only silence. Some mainstream scholars argue that Punt may have been located along the Red Sea coast of modern Eritrea or Somalia, regions with few surviving inscriptions. Others propose it was somewhere in Arabia, perhaps on the southern coast of Yemen. But a more unsettling hypothesis emerges from a set of Biblian inscriptions discovered in the Levant. These refer cryptically to ships of the sun that vanished beyond the lands of incense, as if describing a voyage no one fully understood. In the 1990s, a controversial fringe theory proposed that the Phantom Expedition was not a trade mission at all, but an early exploratory fleet that either never returned or was deliberately erased from subsequent records. The most provocative suggestion comes from a damaged inscription in Egypt's eastern desert. It refers to those who sailed but spoke no more, followed by what appears to be an order to seal records concerning the voyage. Why would such an expedition be erased? One possibility is failure. If a grand fleet vanished, lost to storms, hostile shores, or mutiny, pharaohs might have concealed the disaster to maintain their divine image. Another possibility is political betrayal. Perhaps the fleet served factions whose fall from power led to their achievements being systematically wiped from history, as happened to Hatshepsut's records centuries later. A more speculative theory involves secret trade routes. Some researchers believe Egyptian rulers sought to bypass Levantine and Nubian intermediaries to reach unknown sources of luxury goods directly, possibly even tapping into maritime networks reaching the Indian Ocean. If so, these expeditions may have been state secrets. Only selective records, like temple reliefs glorifying the king, were meant to survive, while logistical details were deliberately destroyed. The absence of evidence elsewhere remains striking. Mesopotamians, Phoenicians, Puntites, peoples known for their record-keeping, leave not a single contemporary mention of this Egyptian fleet. Scholars still debate whether this silence represents genuine loss of material, a misidentification of Punt, or deliberate historical redaction. It's possible the Phantom Expedition really happened, a fleet set out across the Red Sea or beyond, returning with treasures but leaving no trace in foreign archives. Or perhaps it vanished at sea, its failure scrubbed from Egyptian memory, surviving only in stubborn temple reliefs carved too deeply to be entirely erased. Like a ghost ship glimpsed through fog, the expedition lingers on the edges of history, proudly proclaimed by one power, quietly ignored by all others, leaving us to wonder whether it ever truly reached its destination, or whether someone made sure we'd never know. The Astral codebreakers, ancient mathematicians, may have cracked celestial patterns centuries early, long before telescopes swept across the heavens. Ancient sky watchers lifted their eyes to patterns in the stars and carved what they saw into clay, stone, and parchment. For most civilizations, these records were meant to mark the passing of seasons, to guide harvests, rituals, and navigation. But buried among these celestial records are anomalies, calculations and predictions so precise that some scholars believe ancient mathematicians may have decoded complex astronomical cycles centuries before their supposed discovery. The earliest known astronomical tables come from Mesopotamia, specifically Babylon, where scribes meticulously documented the motions of planets as early as the 2nd millennium BCE. Clay tablets from the British Museum's Astronomical Diaries collection contain data spanning centuries, tracking eclipses, Venus cycles, and planetary risings with breathtaking accuracy. Yet a subset of these tablets, dated to around 350 BCE, shows something more advanced. Scholars analysing these texts in the 21st century realised that Babylonian astronomers used a form of geometrical calculation to determine Jupiter's position over time, a mathematical technique not formally documented in the Western world until 14th century Europe. This discovery shattered assumptions about the evolution of mathematics. These Babylonian scribes weren't just observing, they were predicting planetary movement using sophisticated abstract models. But even these astonishing tablets might not be the earliest. A handful of fragmentary texts from the Neo-Assyrian period, 8th century BCE, contain incomplete sequences of numbers that align strikingly with Saros cycles, the repetitive patterns of eclipses known today. The tablets lack explanatory notes, as if the scribes were working with knowledge taken for granted, or perhaps intentionally keeping the underlying formula secret. Egyptian records add another layer. At Dendera Temple, ceiling inscriptions depict a detailed zodiac map, including representations of constellations and planetary deities arranged in precise geometrical relationships. For centuries, Egyptologists dismissed this as symbolic cosmology, but recent studies suggest that the arrangement corresponds closely to actual planetary alignments in specific years, implying that temple architects encoded real astronomical data into sacred architecture. Whether this was for ritual, calendar correction, or something more is still debated. Further afield, in Mesoamerica, the Dresden Codex, one of the few surviving Maya manuscripts, contains extraordinary eclipse tables. These are so accurate that modern astronomers have confirmed their ability to predict solar eclipses over 33-year cycles. Even more striking is their calculation of the synodic period of Venus, 583.92 days, accurate to within fractions of a day. Mainstream archaeology accepts this as evidence of meticulous observation. But some fringe researchers argue that the sheer precision suggests systematic mathematical modelling rather than simple trial and error. One especially puzzling artefact is a bronze gear mechanism found off the coast of Antikythera, Greece, dated to around 100 BCE. Known as the Antikythera mechanism, it used interlocking gears to predict solar and lunar eclipses and track planetary positions. Its complexity stunned modern scientists, who had assumed such mechanical computing wouldn't emerge until 1,400 years later. Was this a sudden leap, or the culmination of centuries of encoded astronomical work passed down through scribal and priestly circles? Some historians believe these breakthroughs were closely guarded. In Mesopotamia, astronomical knowledge was held by the Tupsharu Shame, the scribes of heaven, a small elite whose calculations were used to advise kings, plan military campaigns, and time rituals. In Greece, Pythagorean circles treated astronomical mathematics as esoteric secrets, shared only within closed brotherhoods. Egyptian priests embedded their celestial understanding within temple iconography, accessible only to initiates. Why the secrecy? Power. Control over the heavens meant control over calendars, festivals, taxation cycles, navigation, and even political legitimacy. Predicting eclipses, for example, could make rulers appear divinely favoured, or doom their rivals by associating celestial events with ill omens. In some courts, astronomical calculations were state secrets, punishable by death if shared. Scholars still debate whether these ancient mathematicians truly cracked celestial cycles independently, or whether our interpretation is coloured by modern frameworks. But one thing is clear: their methods were far ahead of their time, hinting at a hidden tradition of astronomical modelling passed between civilizations like a coded language. Somewhere, in the quiet chambers of temples and observatories, a handful of scribes and scholars gazed at the stars, not as mystics, but as codebreakers, unlocking cosmic rhythms long before history says they could. The disappearing dynasty, a ruling line vanished mid-reign, with records systematically wiped. In the great sweep of history, dynasties rise and fall through conquest, famine, or internal decay. Their traces usually remain: broken statues, crumbling inscriptions, half-forgotten royal names. But sometimes a dynasty doesn't simply fall, it vanishes as if pulled from the historical record like a thread from a tapestry, leaving only faint impressions where kings once stood. One of the most haunting of these erasures occurred in ancient Egypt, during the shadowy years between the Middle and New Kingdoms, when an entire line of rulers seems to have disappeared mid-reign, followed by meticulous efforts to erase their existence. The enigma centers on a cluster of rulers often referred to as the Abydos kings, a group that appears briefly on certain king lists, such as the Abydos king list carved into the walls of Seti-Wenet's temple. These lists were not meant as objective records. They were political documents, meant to show legitimate succession, but what makes the Abydos list remarkable is the names that are missing. A sequence of kings believed to have ruled during the Second Intermediate Period appears nowhere else. No tombs, no monuments, no administrative papyri survive for them. In some cases, even the cartouches were later chiselled away, leaving smooth, unnervingly blank spaces. One particularly puzzling figure is a ruler whose name was partially preserved in a fragmentary stela found near Abydos. It refers to "he who rose without name, who vanished in the year of the two floods." No other contemporary record mentions this ruler. Some Egyptologists think he was a usurper or a short-lived local king during a time of political chaos. Others, however, point to evidence of organised erasure, temple inscriptions overwritten, administrative records destroyed in patterns too systematic to be mere neglect. Outside Egypt, Byblos and Levantine archives mention envoys from the House of the Two Crowns who speak with borrowed names. These lines, written during the same hazy decades, have led some historians to propose that members of this dynasty fled, perhaps to foreign courts, ruling as exiles under new titles. If true, their disappearance may have been less an extinction and more a deliberate vanishing act, engineered to avoid destruction during a political purge. The reasons behind the dynasty's erasure remain murky. One theory involves religious heresy. Like the later Amarna period under Akhenaten, this vanished line may have embraced an unpopular theological shift, prompting their successors to wipe their memory. Another theory points to foreign infiltration, possibly by Hyksos or Nubian factions, leading to later rulers excising these kings from official records to present a seamless Egyptian lineage. Even more mysterious are the tomb anomalies. In the Abydos necropolis, several unfinished or deliberately sealed tomb shafts correspond to the period in question. Some were filled with clean sand, an unusual practice in Egyptian burial, often associated with ritual purification or deliberate sealing away of a polluted legacy. Artifacts from these shafts have been found defaced, but not destroyed, as if the names were dangerous, but the objects too valuable to discard. Scribes of the 19th dynasty, who compiled retrospective king lists, had every opportunity to restore these names. Instead, they left intentional blanks, a silence louder than any condemnation. Scholars still debate whether this was mere politics or part of a deeper effort to control the narrative of Egypt's divine kingship, presenting an unbroken line of legitimate rulers where, in reality, a vanished dynasty once reigned. Fringe historians have pushed even further, suggesting that the Abydos kings may have formed a splinter government, relocating to a hidden capital further south or east, possibly along lesser-known Nile tributaries. Their later erasure could then represent a cover-up, hiding a parallel power structure that briefly challenged the main royal line. Mainstream Egyptology remains cautious. There is, after all, no smoking gun text that explains their fate, but the pattern of deliberate erasure is undeniable. Blank cartouches, vanished tombs, missing papyri, and foreign references to nameless envoys. Scholars still debate whether this dynasty was overthrown, erased for heresy, or chose to disappear strategically. Like a chapter torn clean from a scroll, their story exists only in the outline left behind, a dynasty that rose, ruled, and then vanished, not through conquest, but through carefully engineered oblivion. The star couriers, fast communication networks, may have spanned deserts and seas long before known empires, long before the Roman roads tied Europe together, before the Persian royal road cut across Asia, and long before the Silk Road became legend. There may have existed a far older, far quieter web of couriers. Messengers who carried information across mountains, deserts, and oceans with astonishing speed and precision. Scattered clues in inscriptions, trade records, and temple archives suggest the existence of star couriers, individuals or networks who navigated not by roads, but by the night sky, moving messages across vast distances centuries earlier than historians once thought possible. The earliest hint of such a network emerges from Old Kingdom Egypt, where certain administrative papyri refer to runners of the stars, swift messengers tasked with carrying royal decrees as the falcon flies. Egyptologists once assumed this was poetic language, but in the 20th century, excavations in the eastern desert uncovered way stations along hidden caravan paths leading to the Red Sea. Each outpost had wells, storage rooms, and sometimes inscriptions featuring star symbols and cryptic tally marks. Some scholars now suspect these were staging posts for elite couriers, not traders. The star motifs may have functioned as celestial signposts, helping runners and riders navigate at night when desert temperatures were bearable. Meanwhile, in Mesopotamia, Akkadian administrative tablets dating to the reign of Hammurabi, so the 18th century BCE, describe messengers travelling between Babylon and Murray, a journey of over 500 kilometres, in as little as 4 days. This speed is astonishing given the terrain and the technology of the time. To achieve this, they would have needed relay stations and trained couriers, similar to the later Persian Angarium system. Yet these tablets predate the Persian Empire by over a millennium. One tablet even boasts, "The word of the king crossed the dry lands like a star over water." The Hittites, too, provide tantalizing evidence. In the archives of Hattusa, several tablets describe night messengers who follow the fixed lights, implying celestial navigation. Some routes were marked not by landmarks, but by references to specific constellations, which would have appeared in predictable positions in the night sky at different times of year. In effect, these couriers were human star charts, timing their journeys by stellar cycles. Even across the sea, in Minoan Crete, linear A tablets and wall paintings show ships sailing under starry skies with distinctive constellations painted on their sails, likely navigational aids. Some historians believe Minoan merchant fleets doubled as information carriers, passing diplomatic messages between Near Eastern and Aegean polities long before Greek city-states emerged. A handful of Ugaritic tablets refer to the swift ships of the Bull Star, believed to be Minoan vessels guided by Taurus's rising. One of the most intriguing pieces of evidence comes from a Middle Bronze Age cylinder seal found in northern Syria. It depicts a figure handing a scroll to another beneath a sky studded with stars. Around the figures, small dots are etched in what appears to be deliberate constellational patterns. Some researchers think this represents a courier oath, swearing to deliver messages guided by the stars. The strategic value of such a network is immense. In eras when overland travel was perilous and slow, reliable communication could shape empires. A king who received intelligence days before his rivals could preempt invasions, shift alliances, or coordinate distant armies. And because these couriers travelled by night, their movements would have been difficult to intercept, giving their patrons a serious intelligence advantage. Mainstream historians acknowledge that ancient courier systems existed, but they usually place their emergence within large centralized empires like Persia or Rome. The evidence above suggests a more decentralized, older, and perhaps deliberately hidden network operated by priesthoods, merchant guilds, or scribal elites who understood astronomy. Scholars still debate whether these star couriers were a formal institution or a loose confederation of skilled navigators and messengers, but their footprints, way stations in deserts, star-marked tablets, accelerated diplomatic journeys, hint at a communication web spanning continents long before conventional history begins its timeline of global connection. Somewhere in the vast night sky, these couriers found their compass, and through their quiet journeys they may have stitched the ancient world together faster and more subtly than any army ever could. The Salt Road intrigue, trade routes doubled as information pipelines guarded by secret guilds. In the ancient world, salt was power. Empires rose on its trade, armies marched with it, and civilizations depended on it to preserve food and sustain economies. But salt routes weren't just arteries of commerce. They were veins of information, carrying not only goods, but rumours, treaties, coded messages, and secrets. Emerging evidence from inscriptions, merchant archives, and scattered guild records suggests that the salt roads, stretching across deserts, mountain passes, and coastlines, may have been deliberately controlled by clandestine merchant guilds, functioning as both economic monopolies and early intelligence networks. The most famous of these ancient salt routes wound through North Africa, connecting the Saharan salt mines of Tagaza and Taudeni with the Mediterranean coast. By the first millennium BCE, caravans numbering in the thousands transported slabs of salt across dunes, creating an economy that would later feed empires like Carthage and Rome. But long before those imperial structures arose, smaller, family-based merchant guilds controlled these routes. Excavations along caravan paths have uncovered inscribed markers bearing symbols, often simple geometric shapes like spirals, crescents, or intersecting lines that repeated across hundreds of miles. These may have served as secret guild signs, allowing trusted couriers to navigate or identify safe stops, while excluding outsiders. In the Levant, archaeological digs at oasis towns like Palmyra and Katna revealed archives mentioning Brotherhoods of the Salt Road, groups that maintained neutral status during wars, ensuring the movement of caravans between warring states. These brotherhoods possessed their own law codes and arbitration rituals, often recognized by multiple kingdoms. Interestingly, some tablets describe sealed words, phrases exchanged between guild members to authenticate identity reminiscent of passwords. Salt routes also connected distant empires. From the shores of the Dead Sea, rich in mineral salt, caravans travelled east toward Mesopotamia and west toward Egypt. Egyptian administrative papyri from the Middle Kingdom refer to desert waykeepers, trusted intermediaries, tasked with maintaining supply lines and reporting disturbances. Some fringe historians suggest these waykeepers acted not merely as logistical supervisors, but as information gatherers, relaying political intelligence between courts using merchant channels as cover. One particularly revealing set of inscriptions comes from Assyrian administrative tablets dating to the 7th century BCE. These describe merchant convoys moving faster than royal messengers, a remarkable fact in a highly bureaucratic empire. Royal officials complained that the salt bearers know before the king knows. This line has led some historians to propose that salt traders, bound by guild loyalty rather than political allegiance, formed parallel networks of communication that sometimes outpaced state intelligence systems. In China, during the Zhou and Han dynasties, salt was also a heavily regulated commodity, controlled by state monopolies and merchant families alike. Ancient records mention salt inspectors who monitored trade, but also shadow guilds that operated along mountain passes. Some of these guilds are described as silent brothers, exchanging carved tokens rather than written contracts. Similar token systems have been found among Phoenician traders and along Saharan routes, an early form of coded contract verification that bypassed written language entirely. Why the secrecy? Controlling salt routes meant controlling life itself. Armies could be starved, cities crippled, and alliances broken if supply lines faltered. Merchant guilds that dominated these roads wielded outsized influence, often greater than kings along their paths. By transmitting political gossip, trade agreements, or even clandestine diplomatic messages, these guilds became the unseen couriers of empire. Some scholars believe that when two rival states needed to communicate discreetly, they entrusted their messages to these merchants, who moved through war zones unmolested. A particularly striking example comes from a fragmentary Phoenician tablet found near Byblos. It references the sealed salt, a term many interpret as a euphemism for covert negotiations carried out through merchant intermediaries. The same phrase appears centuries later in Carthaginian commercial treaties, suggesting a long-lived tradition of encrypted diplomacy within salt networks. Modern historians still debate the scale of these guilds' power. Some see them as pragmatic trade associations, others view them as proto-intelligence services, using their neutral status and wide reach to collect and disseminate sensitive information. What's certain is that salt roads were more than trade routes. They were information highways, patrolled by guilds whose loyalty was to their brotherhoods, not to empires. In their caravans, beneath the piles of white slabs, may have travelled messages capable of shaping wars and alliances, carried not by envoys in royal livery, but by traders cloaked in dust and silence. The poisoned histories. Chronicles may have been deliberately falsified to discredit enemies. History, we often say, is written by the victors, but sometimes it is not merely written, it is engineered, twisted like a blade to strike down enemies long after battles have ended. Across the ancient world, There are striking cases where official chronicles, royal inscriptions, or religious texts contain inconsistencies and distortions that seem less like errors and more like deliberate acts of political sabotage. These are the poisoned histories, records carefully falsified to destroy reputations, rewrite alliances, or bury rival achievements beneath a veneer of shame or obscurity. One of the most infamous examples comes from ancient Egypt during the aftermath of the Amarna period. Pharaoh Akhenaten, who instituted a revolutionary monotheistic worship of the Aten, was so thoroughly erased after his death that later generations barely knew his name. Temples were defaced, statues smashed, and his city abandoned. But more insidious than the physical erasure was what happened in the chronicles of his successors. Official king lists, like the Abydos list and the Saqqara list, simply skipped over his reign, presenting a seamless line from Amenhotep III to Tutankhamun or Horemheb, as if Akhenaten never existed. Later inscriptions painted him not merely as a heretic, but as a foreign puppet, twisting his legacy into a cautionary tale. This wasn't unique to Egypt. In Mesopotamia, the Assyrians were masters of rewriting history. When Sennacherib destroyed Babylon in 689 BCE, his inscriptions glorified the act as divine vengeance. But when his successor, Esarhaddon, rebuilt Babylon years later to gain political favour, new chronicles were issued portraying Sennacherib's actions as misguided and impious. The official records of the same dynasty presented two conflicting narratives, tailored to shifting political needs. Babylonian scribes, too, sometimes retroactively altered king lists, inserting or deleting names to legitimize rival claimants. The Hittites offer another revealing case. During the reign of Mursili II, 14th century BCE, a devastating plague struck the empire. Mursili blamed the disaster on the sins of his predecessor, Suppiluliuma, accusing him of breaking treaties and angering the gods. Modern historians suspect this was propaganda, designed to consolidate Mursili's rule by blackening his predecessor's name. The original treaties Suppiluliuma allegedly violated have not survived. Their absence may itself be part of this calculated rewriting. Even Greek historians, often praised for their critical methods, participated in political narrative building. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, framed the Persian Wars as a moral struggle between freedom and tyranny, casting the Greeks as defenders of liberty and the Persians as decadent oppressors. While this makes for compelling literature, it ignores Persian administrative records, showing more nuanced political motives. Later Greek writers went further, vilifying opponents of their city-states in ways that blurred fact and fiction, shaping reputations for centuries. Sometimes the falsification was surgical. A single changed name in a treaty, a shifted date in a king list, or a selectively lost archive could erase an enemy's legitimate claim. In Byblos, an inscription referring to a marriage alliance between two royal houses was later found to have the groom's name chiselled out and replaced, implying a retrospective rewriting of lineage to delegitimize his descendants. Why falsify history? Because narrative is power. In ancient societies where literacy was limited and official inscriptions carried divine authority, to control the chronicle was to control reality itself. A discredited enemy became a non-entity. A rival lineage, if struck from king lists, ceased to have divine sanction. Religious heretics could be transformed into villains through temple reliefs. Foreign allies could become barbarians in the eyes of future generations. Modern scholars use textual criticism, archaeology, and cross-cultural comparison to unravel these distortions, but many poisoned histories remain undetected. Scholars still debate whether some anomalies, like sudden gaps in king lists or unexplained duplications of rulers, reflect genuine confusion or intentional falsification. These ancient propagandists were not sloppy. They were meticulous, understanding that posterity is a battlefield. Long after swords rusted, their edits remained etched in stone, shaping the narratives we inherit today. Somewhere between the inscriptions and the silences lies the truth. But as history shows, sometimes the sharpest weapons are not spears or blades, but chisels and pens. The exiled engineer, a single vanished innovator, may have carried technology across continents. Throughout the ancient world, technological innovations often appeared suddenly, almost inexplicably. Complex metallurgy, advanced irrigation, monumental architecture, or astronomical instruments emerging in regions where no prior developmental stages are clearly visible. Historians typically explain this through cultural diffusion, ideas spreading slowly through trade, migration, or parallel invention. But a persistent fringe theory, supported by a scattering of enigmatic records, suggests a more dramatic scenario: that a single, brilliant engineer or group of innovators, exiled or fleeing from political upheaval, may have carried crucial technological knowledge across continents, seeding advancements in distant lands. The earliest tantalizing clue comes from Hittite Anatolia, circa 13th century BCE. A damaged tablet discovered in the archives of Hattusa tells of a maker of water and fire who departed the king's wrath and walked to the lands beyond the setting sun. The phrase maker of water and fire is unusual. Some scholars interpret it as a poetic description of someone skilled in hydraulic and metallurgical engineering, two fields in which the Hittites excelled. This mysterious figure's departure coincides with the sudden decline of Hittite irrigation infrastructure in certain provinces, as if key expertise vanished overnight. Around the same time, in northern Mesopotamia, administrative tablets refer cryptically to the foreign smith who builds canals, a figure who arrived from the lands of the setting sun and was granted sanctuary by a local king. The records credit him with improving water channels and teaching local workers unfamiliar techniques. Some fringe historians argue that this could be the same individual mentioned in the Hittite text, now Worki, Nang in Mesopotamia under a different name. Egyptian records may hint at the same phenomenon. A New Kingdom papyrus describes a foreign water priest arriving at Thebes who showed the hidden paths of the river beneath the earth, likely a metaphor for subterranean irrigation or flood control. His origins are left vague, but the text notes he came from lands whose tongue is unknown, bearing metal as smooth as glass. The story doesn't end there. Centuries later, around the dawn of the Iron Age, advanced furnace technologies appeared almost simultaneously in disparate regions, from Anatolia and the Levant to India. Some historians attribute this to incremental development. Others note that the earliest iron smelting sites share strikingly similar furnace designs despite vast distances. This has led to speculation that itinerant metallurgists, possibly exiles, carried specialized knowledge along trade and migration routes. Perhaps the most famous example is the legend of Daedalus, the mythical Greek inventor who built the labyrinth for King Minos and later fled Crete after falling out of favor. While a mythological figure, Daedalus embodies the archetype of the exiled engineer whose skills transform distant lands. Greek writers credited him with introducing advanced building techniques wherever he went. Similar legends appear in Mesopotamia and Persia, wandering craftsmen who brought fire, canals, or star lore from fallen kingdoms. Archaeologically, a curious pattern supports the notion of knowledge carriers. In several sites across the eastern Mediterranean, the earliest examples of certain technological innovations appear fully formed, without clear experimental predecessors. For example, at some Levantine sites, early iron furnaces emerge that closely resemble Hittite designs, despite no local development curve. Similarly, canal systems in parts of Mesopotamia show sudden improvements, consistent with the arrival of external expertise rather than gradual innovation. Why exile? In ancient courts, engineers and artisans often served kings directly, their skills tied to royal favour. Falling out with a ruler or finding oneself on the losing side of a palace coup could mean death or flight. Skilled specialists who escaped could become highly prized assets for rival states, especially if they possessed knowledge that could tip the balance of power in war or resource control. Scholars still debate whether the scattered references to foreign smiths, water priests, and makers of fire represent one individual, a guild, or a literary archetype repeated across cultures. But the timing of technological leaps often aligns eerily with periods of political turmoil and population displacement. The figure of the exiled engineer may never be pinned down to a single name, but in the shadows of collapsing empires, when scribes wrote of strangers bearing strange skills, something real may lie behind the myth. A handful of brilliant minds carrying the blueprints of their age across deserts and seas, quietly redrawing the technological map of the ancient world. The Lunar Pact. Rulers allegedly timed invasions to celestial events with unnerving precision. In the ancient world, the moon was far more than a silent satellite in the sky. It was a clock, a calendar, a god, and, perhaps most disturbingly, a weapon. Across civilizations, there are scattered records and inscriptions that suggest some rulers not only observed celestial cycles, but strategically timed military invasions, political coups, and religious reforms to coincide with rare lunar events, eclipses, supermoons, or significant conjunctions. Scholars call this phenomenon the Lunar Pact, an unspoken strategy in which cosmic timing amplified human ambition. One of the most compelling examples comes from Mesopotamia, where lunar eclipses were believed to foretell the fate of kings. Babylonian astronomers meticulously tracked lunar cycles, recording not only eclipses but subtle variations in moonrise and moonset. A set of tablets from the Neo-Assyrian period, 7th century BCE, describes an eclipse so total that the stars rose in midday, followed shortly thereafter by a swift military campaign by King Ashurbanipal into Elamite territory. Some historians see this as coincidence. Others note that Ashurbanipal's armies had been mobilizing months prior, suggesting he timed the final strike to align with the eclipse, which he could predict thanks to the Babylonian mastery of Saros cycles. The psychological impact of eclipses in antiquity was enormous. To common people and even many elites, an eclipse signified divine displeasure, royal death, or apocalyptic change. Armies might panic, cities might crumble into ritual confusion. A ruler who commanded the moon could appear as a god. The Assyrians even had a practice known as the substitute king ritual. If an ominous eclipse was predicted, a temporary king would be installed to absorb the celestial wrath, then quietly removed. Imagine the advantage if a ruler flipped this, triggering war precisely when rivals were paralyzed by fear. Egyptian sources provide another clue. In the Temple of Edfu, inscriptions describe a great battle that began on the night when the moon turned to blood. While many Egyptologists interpret this as mythological language, astronomical retro-calculations suggest a total lunar eclipse occurred during the reign of Thutmose III that matches the description. That same month, Thutmose launched a surprise night attack against a Canaanite coalition at Megiddo, one of his most famous victories. Was this mere poetic coincidence, or did Egyptian astronomer priests help him weaponize the sky? In the Aegean world, Linear B tablets from Mycenae mention the dark moon night as a designated time for mustering ships. Later, Greek historians recorded tales of generals choosing to invade during eclipses to sow panic, most famously during the Peloponnesian War, when Nicias's army delayed retreat due to a lunar eclipse, leading to their destruction. but some less studied passages from Hittite chronicles mention treaties and invasions tied to the return of the silver eye, a phrase some scholars interpret as reference to lunar conjunctions. Farther east in China's Shang dynasty oracle bones, c. 1200 BCE, rulers inscribed divination questions about whether to attack neighbouring tribes during lunar eclipses. Some inscriptions suggest affirmative answers led directly to campaigns. The ability to anticipate lunar events gave kings enormous political leverage, to appear as if they controlled heavenly will. Fringe researchers go further, arguing that some ancient elites formed secret pacts with astronomer priests, timing not just wars but dynastic overthrows with celestial phenomena. They claim this allowed coups to occur when populations were awestruck or terrified, ensuring minimal resistance. While mainstream historians view such claims skeptically, there's no doubt that astronomical knowledge was often kept within tight priestly circles. In Mesopotamia, the Tupsharu Shammai, scribes of heaven, were sworn to secrecy. In Egypt, only a few high priests tracked exact lunar cycles. If rulers coordinated with these keepers of the calendar, they could stage events to appear cosmically ordained. Why the moon? Because unlike rare planetary conjunctions, lunar cycles were predictable and visible to all. A well-timed eclipse could be foretold by the few and experienced by the many, turning rulers into apparent prophets. Battles launched under such conditions weren't just military operations, they were cosmic theatre, designed to awe subjects and enemies alike. Scholars still debate how deliberate this coordination truly was. Some argue that celestial events were retrospectively woven into chronicles to legitimize victories. Others believe rulers genuinely planned around these phenomena, using early astronomical calculations as strategic tools. Whatever the case, the pattern is clear. Across continents and centuries, moments of lunar drama align uncannily with decisive acts of power. Whether through fear, faith, or sheer spectacle, some rulers appear to have signed their ambitions in the light of the moon, crafting a lunar pact between the heavens and their earthly will. The glass dagger, a strange artifact, implies covert assassinations shaped succession lines. In the shifting palaces of ancient empires, power rarely changed hands peacefully. Dynastic succession was often a deadly game, where thrones were secured not only through open conquest or royal decree, but through whispers, poisons, and blades hidden in the night. Among the strangest clues to this shadowy underworld is a single object, a translucent, glass-like dagger, unearthed in a royal tomb, whose material and placement suggest it may have been a tool of silent surgical power rather than ceremonial grandeur. Over time, similar discoveries and textual hints have led scholars to speculate that covert assassinations, possibly carried out with specialized weapons, played a far greater role in shaping royal lineages than surviving chronicles admit. The artifact in question was discovered in the 1930s at a site near Ugarit, a cosmopolitan port city on the Levantine coast that flourished during the Late Bronze Age. Inside a tomb believed to belong to a high-ranking official, perhaps a royal cousin, archaeologists found a dagger blade crafted from obsidian and fused silicate, so finely polished it was almost transparent. The blade was razor-thin yet unbroken, its edges sharper than steel. Curiously, the hilt was wrapped not in gold or ivory, as with ceremonial daggers, but in plain leather, worn smooth from handling. No inscriptions, no religious motifs, just a functional lethal instrument. Obsidian blades were not uncommon in the ancient world, but this one stood apart. Microscopic analysis, decades later, revealed minute traces of resin and alkaloids along its edge, substances consistent with plant-based toxins found in the region. It appears this blade may have been poisoned. Obsidian's molecular structure makes it ideal for holding toxins. Unlike metal, it doesn't corro, or react, A single small incision could deliver a deadly dose while leaving minimal evidence on the body, a perfect weapon for stealth killings in royal courts. Historical texts seem to echo this possibility. A Hittite tablet recounts a royal death by the invisible wound, where a king died suddenly during a feast with no signs of struggle. Egyptian papyri mention assassinations in the night chamber, where no sword was drawn and no cry was heard. In Neo-Assyrian chronicles, scribes describe suspicious royal deaths as the moon taking the breath, a euphemism some believe masked internal coups. Obsidian, glass, and crystal blades had another advantage. They could shatter or dissolve into unrecognizable fragments, leaving little forensic trace. In some tombs, archaeologists have found empty scabbards without accompanying blades, suggesting these weapons were deliberately removed or destroyed after use. A few late Bronze Age graves even contain deliberately broken obsidian shards placed in containers as if to bury the evidence with the dead. Why use such weapons? In royal courts, open murder often led to civil wars or public unrest. But if a king or crown prince simply fell ill overnight or collapsed after a feast, the transition of power could be presented as natural or divinely ordained. This was especially convenient in societies where the health of the king was tied to cosmic order. Unexplained death could be framed as fate, not treachery. A faction with access to specialized assassins could change dynasties without armies, shifting history through targeted eliminations. One particularly intriguing text comes from a late Egyptian scroll describing a conspiracy against Ramesses III, the famous Harem Conspiracy Papyrus. It details how members of the royal household plotted to assassinate the pharaoh. While the method remains vague, the conspirators were said to use secret instruments and substances unknown to the physicians. Modern forensic analysis of Ramesses III's mummy revealed a deep cut to his throat, almost certainly a swift, targeted attack. The obsidian dagger discovered at Ugarit dates to roughly the same period, raising questions about whether similar assassination tools circulated quietly between elite circles. Fringe historians go further, proposing the existence of specialized guilds of poisoners and assassins, operating along diplomatic and trade networks. Obsidian, prized for its sharpness, travelled widely through Near Eastern trade routes, so did resins and alkaloids. Some suggest these networks may have supplied both the tools and the knowledge required for elite political killings, making them the shadow brokers of succession. Mainstream scholars are more cautious. They acknowledge the existence of political assassinations, but stop short of positing organised trans-regional networks. Still, the archaeological and textual clues align in unsettling ways. Scholars still debate whether the Ugarit dagger was ceremonial, symbolic, or practical, but its design, chemical traces, and placement whisper of a story that official chronicles tried to bury, that some of the most important turning points in royal lineages may have hinged not on armies or treaties, but on a single, nearly invisible cut made in the dark. The encoded temples, sacred architecture may conceal intelligence about migrations and maps. When we step into ancient temples, we usually imagine priests chanting hymns, worshippers offering sacrifices, and rituals unfolding beneath the gaze of gods. But some archaeologists and fringe researchers argue that temples were not just houses of worship, they were repositories of encoded knowledge, where migrations, trade routes, and even cartographic data were woven into walls, floors, and alignments. These structures, they suggest, functioned like stone archives, preserving information for those initiated to read their hidden language. Perhaps the most famous example is Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, dated to around 9600 BCE, millennia before the rise of agriculture and cities. The megalithic pillars are covered in animal reliefs, arranged with striking precision. For years, these carvings were interpreted as spiritual symbols, but in 2017, a controversial study proposed that the pillars may encode constellations and astronomical events, including a comet impact around 10,950 BCE. If true, the site functions like a vast cosmic record, preserving not just myth, but chronological markers tied to real celestial phenomena. Similar patterns emerge in Egyptian temples, particularly at Dendera and Karnak, where entire temple complexes were aligned with specific star risings and solstices. While such alignments often had ritual significance, some Egyptologists have begun to reconsider whether they also served practical geographic or navigational functions. The Dendera zodiac, carved on a temple ceiling, appears to encode precise star maps. Some researchers suggest these star maps may have been used to calibrate calendars and migrations, guiding travelers and pilgrims through predictable seasonal cycles. In Mesoamerica, the Maya pyramid temple complexes, like those at Chiche, En Itzá and Uxmal, show architectural alignments that correspond not only to solstices and equinoxes, but to distant mountain peaks and celestial navigation points. The E-group architectural style, found across Maya sites, consistently points to sunrise positions on specific calendar dates. Some anthropologists argue that these orientations mark travel routes between highland and lowland settlements, embedding migratory and trade information into sacred design, ensuring it would survive through religious tradition rather than fragile manuscripts. One of the most intriguing pieces of evidence comes from Abydos, Egypt, where a series of carved corridors beneath the temple of Seti Wen contain enigmatic reliefs of boats, birds, and landforms. Early explorers thought these were decorative or mythological, but when the carvings are viewed sequentially, they seem to trace a journey along the Nile and beyond, almost like a map carved in symbolic form. Some scholars propose that initiates were trained to read these temple reliefs the way a navigator reads a chart. Similar map temples appear in India, where Vedic-era fire altars are laid out with astonishing geometric precision, mirroring not just constellations, but regional landforms. The shapes of rivers, mountain ranges, and pilgrimage routes seem encoded within the ritual ground plans, blending geography with cosmology. The Shulba Sutras, ancient texts describing altar construction, contain sophisticated geometric instructions that predate Greek mathematics by centuries. Some researchers now believe these geometries had practical migratory functions, guiding ritual movements across vast territories. Why encode maps in temples? Because stone endures, parchments burn, clay tablets crumble, oral traditions shift, but temples remain. By embedding critical information about migrations, trade, or celestial navigation into sacred architecture, ancient societies could transmit essential knowledge across generations, even if languages or regimes changed. Priests, as custodians of these temples, became keepers of encoded intelligence, their rituals doubling as mnemonic systems to preserve geographic memory. Mainstream scholars acknowledge the astronomical alignments, but remain cautious about broader claims. Some argue that these alignments were purely ritual, reflecting religious cosmologies rather than practical navigation. Others, however, point to the consistency and precision across regions as evidence of deliberate encoding. The line between spiritual symbolism and geographic intelligence may have been far blurrier in the ancient world than modern categories suggest. One particularly provocative idea is that temple networks formed information corridors, where migrating groups could move along sacred sites that doubled as waypoints. Each temple encoded its location and relationship to others through alignments, carvings, and ritual calendars. Initiates travelling these routes could reconstruct vast maps by reading the stars and stones together, long before formal cartography emerged. Scholars still debate how intentional this encoding was, and whether we are fully capable of deciphering it today. But when we look at these ancient temples through a new lens, not just as spiritual monuments, but as repositories of migration and navigation data, they take on a startling new dimension. The ancients may not have drawn maps on parchment. Instead, they may have built them in stone, embedding their journeys, routes and cosmic bearings into the very walls of their most sacred spaces. The Night of the Erasures, a coordinated purge of archives across regions, suggests shared intent. It was not fire alone that consumed the records of the ancient world. Sometimes history wasn't lost by accident, it was systematically erased. Across several civilizations, there are unsettling moments when archives, libraries, inscriptions and monuments were deliberately destroyed, altered or sealed within the same narrow time frames, often spanning multiple regions. These events weren't always tied to a single empire's collapse or foreign invasion. Instead, they suggest something far more deliberate, a coordinated, multi-regional purge of knowledge, remembered faintly in scattered fragments as what some historians now call the Night of the Erasures. The most famous example, of course, is the Library of Alexandria, whose destruction is often depicted as a singular catastrophe. But in reality, Alexandria suffered multiple burnings and purges during Julius Caesar's campaign, 48 BCE, under Emperor Aurelian, 270 CE, and again in later centuries. Each time, different categories of documents disappeared, not just Greek philosophy, but Egyptian temple archives and foreign diplomatic texts. This piecemeal eradication suggests not merely incidental war damage, but targeted removal of politically or culturally sensitive materials. Around the same period, in Mesopotamia, archaeological layers reveal sudden, clean sweeps of cuneiform tablets. At sites like Uruk, Babylon, and Sippar, thousands of tablets were broken, defaced, or buried in systematic dumps. Many of these were administrative or astronomical records, rather than mythological stories. Intriguingly, radiocarbon dating places several of these purges within a tight 50-70-year window, overlapping with political shifts in both Mesopotamia and Egypt during the late 1st millennium BCE. In Anatolia, the fall of the Hittite Empire, called 1200 BCE, is often blamed on external invasions and internal strife. Yet at Hattusa, excavations have revealed that certain archives were deliberately burned, while others were carefully sealed behind walls. This selective destruction implies intention. Among the sealed archives were ritual texts, astronomical records, and diplomatic treaties, precisely the kinds of knowledge that could be used to reconstruct political structures or celestial calendars after the empire's fall. Further west, Minoan and Mycenaean sites show abrupt cessations in Linear A and Linear B tablet production, sometimes right before destructive events. In certain cases, scribes appear to have wiped entire archives clean, possibly through burning or dispersal, as though anticipating invasion. But some tablets were buried intentionally in foundation layers, a practice that may indicate deliberate concealment rather than destruction. Perhaps the most striking example comes from China's Qin dynasty. In 213 BCE, Emperor Qin Shi Huang ordered the burning of books and burying of scholars, targeting historical and philosophical works that contradicted the new imperial ideology. Although this is well documented, what is less discussed is how similar intellectual purges were occurring almost simultaneously across other civilizations, thousands of miles away. While there's no evidence of a direct connection, the synchrony of archival destruction across regions has led some scholars to wonder whether there were shared ideological motives, parallel crises, or even indirect networks of elites exchanging methods of control. Why destroy archives? In every case, the motives seem eerily similar: to consolidate power, control narratives, and erase competing histories. Astronomy records could be used to legitimize rival rulers through celestial omens. Diplomatic archives could expose inconvenient alliances. Philosophical texts could inspire dissent. In societies where written knowledge was held by a select few, targeted erasure could reshape reality itself. Fringe researchers have even speculated that a coordinated effort may have taken place among priestly or royal elites to reset collective memory, ensuring that inconvenient knowledge, technological, astronomical, or political, would not survive transitional eras. While this remains speculative, mainstream historians agree that the sheer scale and simultaneity of these purges is unusual. Scholars still debate whether these events were independent but parallel reactions to upheaval, or part of a broader trans-regional pattern of knowledge control. What's beyond doubt is that the Night of the Erasures, whether literal or metaphorical, marked turning points. Civilizations emerging from these purges often displayed new ideological frameworks and truncated historical consciousness, as if someone had cut and spliced the scroll of history. What we've lost may be even more staggering than what remains. Tablets turned to dust, scrolls burned to ash, inscriptions smoothed into silence. But the synchronized rhythms of these erasures suggest that forgetting was engineered, not accidental, a darkness that swept archives as surely as armies swept cities. The Great Concealment. Final evidence hints at a global network that deliberately rewrote history. Throughout these scattered clues, erased names, encoded temples, vanishing dynasties, and secret courier networks, a shadow takes shape. It is not the shape of a single empire, religion, or conspiracy, but something larger, more elusive. The possibility that powerful groups across regions may have cooperated, or at least acted in parallel, to control the flow of knowledge itself. Historians have a name for this faint, unsettling pattern: the Great Concealment. It represents not one event, but a gradual, coordinated redaction of collective memory, visible only in the seams of what remains. The first hints lie in the chronological gaps. Ancient King lists from Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, and Mesoamerica all contain missing years, repeated rulers, or overlapping reigns that cannot be reconciled with astronomy or archaeology. Traditional explanations cite scribal error, political bias, or simple loss of material, but some historians argue these anomalies show signs of intentional compression or expansion of timelines, perhaps to synchronize narratives between ruling elites or to create artificial lineages that gave divine legitimacy to new regimes. Another strand comes from linguistic synchrony. Across regions that supposedly had no contact, key terms for hidden knowledge, sealed words, or keepers of the tongue appear in astonishingly similar contexts, from Akkadian Nisirti Shah Shipri to Egyptian cryptographic hieroglyphs to Chinese oracle bone phrases referring to sealed heavens. These are not casual metaphors. They consistently appear in administrative or priestly contexts, where control of information equaled control of power. The architectural evidence aligns uneasily with these patterns. Temples, ziggurats, pyramids, and megalithic sites often show standard insight. Astronomical alignments, solstices, star risings, lunar cycles despite vast geographic separation. Some scholars attribute this to universal observation of the heavens. Others suggest that certain groups shared a codified system, transmitting it through merchant guilds, priesthoods, or itinerant engineers. Perhaps the most telling pieces are parallel purges and resets, like the Night of the Erasures. These weren't isolated accidents, but waves of deliberate forgetting echoing across continents. In each case, elites emerged afterward with simplified histories, streamlined genealogies, and centralized ideologies. What if these were not coincidental crises, but deliberate acts of historical engineering? A provocative example lies in calendar reforms. Between roughly 800 BCE and 200 CE, Many civilizations, including the Romans, Chinese, Hindus, and Maya, implemented significant calendar restructurings, shifting how time itself was measured. These reforms often erased years, redefined eras, or recentered political power on new epochs. Scholars usually treat these changes as local political maneuvers, but taken together, they suggest something more coordinated, a shared impulse to reset time, to draw a line between the old world and the new. Who, then, might have been capable of orchestrating such large-scale redactions? Some imagine a formalized network of elite priestly classes, scribal circles, or merchant guilds who, over centuries, maintained communication through coded language, star-based navigation, and sacred architecture, ensuring that knowledge could be selectively spread or suppressed. Others propose a looser phenomenon, parallel power structures in different regions, each discovering that controlling collective memory was the ultimate tool of governance, and thus acting in similar ways without direct coordination. Mainstream scholars hesitate to speak of global networks in pre-modern eras, citing the limits of communication. But evidence of long-distance trade, shared navigational systems, and strikingly similar astronomical and mythic motifs has eroded the notion of strictly isolated civilizations. In this new light, the Great Concealment may not require a singular hidden cabal, only a convergence of interests among those who ruled. What's most haunting is how little remains of what might have been erased. A chipped tablet here, a star alignment there, a dagger buried in silence. The Great Concealment isn't a single puzzle to solve, but a negative space, a silence stretching across time. Scholars still debate whether these patterns reflect real, deliberate coordination, or are simply the echoes of unrelated collapses and reforms. But even skeptics admit the simultaneity, selectivity, and sophistication of these erasures and alterations are hard to ignore. If there was a global strategy, whether conscious cooperation or parallel innovation, its brilliance lay in never leaving a central archive, never forming an empire that could be toppled. Instead, it lived in whispers between scribes, alignments in stone, passwords along salt roads, and timed acts beneath eclipsed moons. We will likely never find a smoking gun, no hidden minutes of a world council deciding what humanity should forget. But we may continue to find fragments at the edges, where myth, archaeology, and anomaly meet. It is in these margins that the faint outline of a world that edited itself begins to appear. Conclusion. As our journey through these 21 conspiracies ends, a pattern emerges. Power is not only seized through armies and laws, but through stories, calendars, and silence. Ancient elites may have understood something profound, that controlling memory is the highest form of control, whether through secret scribal networks, lunar-timed invasions, encoded temples, or synchronized erasures. History was not simply recorded, it was sculpted, often with a chisel as sharp as any blade. Some of these stories may be myths, others fragments of forgotten realities. Scholars still debate each case, their arguments echoing the same uncertainties left by vanished archives. But together, they remind us that what we call history is only what survived the edits. And somewhere beneath layers of stone and centuries of silence, other versions of our past still sleep, waiting to be read